Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here with my latest reading wrap-up. I know it's been a little while, sorry. As I said in my previous video, it's been kind of a mixture of things. I've been struggling to read, and it's also been a little busy. It was Aaron's birthday yesterday, and the weekend before, we went up to a friend's ranch, and we spent a little time there, which was nice, and I actually got a decent amount of reading done there. I've actually got, I think, 6 books to talk about, which is pretty decent compared to what I've been doing lately. In fact, I've been kind of making myself sit down for a little bit every night and try and read at least a chapter of something. So hopefully I'm going to kind of speed things along a little more, get through some stuff, because there's a lot of stuff I've been wanting to get through, and there's a lot of stuff on that I'm in the middle of, that I've been in the middle of for a while, that I need to make progress on. But I've got a few book club reads here. I've got a few reading event reads here, so I was very happy to get to a lot of those things. So yeah, let's get started. I don't have the first book with me because I lent it out to a friend, but I read Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is a very popular book. This is actually one of the book club reads. It was my friend Laura, who runs the book club. This is like one of her favorite books, and we all voted on it for last month. So I was very excited to get to it because I read Susanna Clarke's previous book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, a couple years ago, and I really, really liked it. I've been meaning to get to this for a while, like ever since it came out. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. This is actually a 5-star read for me. It's the first 5-star read I've had in a little while. I feel that it's better if you go into it not knowing much about it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I don't want to give too much away. This is presented as a series of journals from this guy who's only known as Piranesi. He lives in this massive mansion that's basically, it's 3 levels. The bottom is all flooded, the top has like rains and stuff, and the middle is where he spends most of his time, and it's all filled to the brim with statues depicting various sort of vaguely kind of mythological figures, like kings or, washerwomen or like minotaurs and things like that. And through his journals, he basically presents this study of what he calls the house. To him, the house is the only thing that he knows. It's the only conception of the world that he has. And as far as he knows, he's pretty much the only other person there. He spends his days, fishing, exploring, writing notes. There's some bones throughout the house that he checks on and kind of takes care of throughout the day. You kind of get a sense of it's this very kind of solitary life as he's kind of exploring the world as he knows it. But there is one other person here that he meets up with every week, named who he only refers to as the Other, and the Other has sort of enlisted him as a research assistant of sorts to discover this mysterious great power that he wishes to unlock through some arcane means. So this book kind of made a lot of waves when it came out, I think, because as you can tell kind of from the description of it, it's basically liminal space crack, the house is this decrepit, sort of abandoned mansion museum kind of feeling thing with multiple levels, and there's all these mysterious marble statues depicting various characters, and there's kind of the ruined aspect to it with it's frequently being flooded and things like that. There's seagulls that are kind of like roosting in the halls and things like that. As I say, it's very of the moment in terms of like the whole liminal space craze. In fact, actually, with sort of the descriptions of it, with sort of the marble statues, the white walls, the floor, the crumbling aspects of it, I was almost picturing like a vaporwave album cover, or like a Microsoft Encarta kind of thing, like Mind Maze, if anybody remembers that. It's very, very evocative and atmospheric. And Piranesi is actually a really sweet character. You learn more about him as it goes on, but he's got this personality where he's very trusting, kind of to a fault, but he's also very sweet and very conscientious, and he's always trying to be very helpful. We kept describing him in the book club as like a cinnamon roll. He's just really adorable, and especially with how like eager he is to help out the Other. and just how conscientious he is of things like, the way that he looks after the bones of these other people who may have once lived in the house. He's very reverent with the way that it's almost ritualized how he looks after them and cleans them up, makes sure they're all arranged and everything. He's just a very sweet, good-natured, trusting character, and I was kind of hooked on him immediately. I was like, if anything bad happens to him, and of course, as you can probably glean, there is more going on, but I will leave that up to you to discover. I thought it was really, really intriguing. The character's voice is very well depicted. His sort of naivete and his belief in the house, he says throughout the book, the house provides and things like that. And there's this interesting stylistic tick throughout the novel where a lot of things like house or waves or things like that are capitalized because, to him, it's like, that is the thing. It's like, it's not just one example of something, it's not a representation of something. It is the thing, and it gives it this kind of, again, this very kind of mythic, almost quasi-spiritual, religious aspect to it that I thought was really intriguing. And the mystery that is uncovered throughout the book is indeed also very intriguing. The book is split into 5 parts, and I kind of tried to force myself to kind of pace myself because I didn't want to just rush through everything. I wanted to savor it, but I was enjoying it so much that I did just blast through over the course of a week. The backstory that's revealed about some of the things that are happening has a lot of sort of verisimilitude to it. There's little cultural references here and there that add a lot of verisimilitude and things like that. But again, I don't want to give too much away. I really do think it's better if you go in not knowing anything. But the YouTuber Liminal Spaces, who I've mentioned before, he's a great YouTuber, talks all about sort of weird fiction, liminal fiction, all kinds of, and anything that kind of falls under the umbrella of the uncanny or the liminal or the weird, as you might guess by his name. He did a really excellent review and deep dive on the book, and I'll link both below in the description if you want to learn more. His review is spoiler-free, but if you've read the book and you kind of want, as I say, a very detailed and insightful deep dive on it, you can watch that, and I'll leave that in the description. It's much more, he's much more articulate than I am, so, but I just thought this was a great book. The characters were really likable, the mystery was intriguing, and it went in a couple directions that I didn't expect in terms of the way things turned out. And indeed, without, again, going into details, I thought the ending was very bittersweet in a very moving way. It actually made me a little emotional. It was just really refreshing to read something that felt so unique and original and was presented in such an intriguing way. So yeah, highly, highly recommend that. Next, I have this. This is a Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters. This was part of a reading event that was organized by Wes Laveau, who I've collabed with on the channel before. Again, I'll link him in the description. And he wanted to do a reading event where we read sort of small town fiction. And he talked about specifically Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson, Our Town by Thornton Wilder, and this book, which I'd never heard of. I read Winesburg, Ohio a few years ago, and I really liked it. And of course, I read Our Town in school and stuff. And, with reading events, it's kind of hard for me to fully commit to the full kind of swath of selections that people choose. So I figured I would stick with this since I'd never heard of it before, I'd never read it before. And I'm glad I did because it was really intriguing. So this is a collection of poetry from 1915 that basically is presented as a series of ruminations from the various characters who live in this town called Spoon River, which is in Milwaukee, I believe. I can't remember. It's in the Midwest. I believe it's Milwaukee, but I'll put it up if I'm wrong. So these poems are all set in this Midwestern community among the graveyard. And so every poem in this collection is a member of this community kind of speaking from beyond the grave and explaining some of their lives, their backstories, what led to their deaths, all kinds of things like that. And that just sounded really intriguing to me. And indeed, it was. I don't read a lot of poetry, mostly because I find a lot of it kind of inscrutable. A lot of the times I read poems and I just don't understand. I'm just kind of like, huh? What am I supposed to get out of that? They can feel kind of obtuse a lot of the time. I do like poetry, it's just not my main area of interest or expertise. But this is all written in free verse, very sort of Walt Whitman-esque. In fact, it was compared frequently to Walt Whitman. So as I say, the whole thing is presented, it's all different members of the town and you learn little things about them through their poems. And there's kind of a wide gamut. Some of the poems are about their deaths specifically. Some of their poems are about their lives and what led to, and sort of their hopes and dreams. Some of the poems are kind of more just metaphysical musings on death and life and things like that. And as you read through the book, you get this sort of tableau of everyone in the town and all their various sort of foibles and hardships and relationships, how everything kind of fits together. So you'll hear in the book about, one character, like, for example, a character who, say, like, cheated on somebody. And then the next poem will be about the wife of that person who was cheated on and how they feel about it. And sometimes it kind of reveals sort of a deeper waters than you expected. It kind of turns things on their head and makes things more sort of nuanced. So you hear about various characters throughout the book and how they all fit together. And it's really interesting to kind of slowly piece together some of the various like stories. And some of the poems are very like sort of, as you would expect, very sort of dark and poetic and very, metaphysical and very serious. Some of them are like fun, more funny. Like, so for example, one of the poems that I remember really liking is about this guy who wanted to go to college, but his aunt wouldn't let him, so he killed her. He made it look like she died of heart failure and stuff like that, and he ends the poem basically saying like, joke's on you and stuff like that, very, very mordant humor. And there's also a lot of, as I say, sort of moving stuff about life and death and the whims of small town life and of fate and things like that. And it was interesting to read because, you read a lot of these sort of small town stories and you expect a lot of sort of romanticism and stuff like that and kind of a pining for, the old days and things like that. And there is a bit of that. But what's interesting as you sort of read through and you sort of gather together this tableau of characters, you realize so many of them were sort of held back by, their stations in life, by, public perceptions, by, the prejudice of a small town. There was one poem, for example, that I thought was very relevant that was about this guy who put up a library in town. And he was sort of chastised for putting in, evil books instead of just, pious, spiritual literature and things like that. And he talks about how important it is to understand, good and evil and, light and dark and things like that. So it doesn't shy away from a lot of that, the prejudices and the pressures and of small town life, while also, having, the romantic sort of ideals of it at the same time. And I thought that was interesting to have a very nuanced view of things, especially from a book that's, from 1915. There's quite the breadth of characters, and there's a lot of sympathy for characters that you wouldn't expect. Like, there's stuff about, like, abortions, there's, stuff about, prejudice and things like that. There's a lot of sympathy for the downtrodden and kind of the dregs of society that I didn't expect from a book this old. And as I say, it presents this very nuanced view. I'd like to read, actually, one of my favorite poems in the collection. I took pictures of a bunch that I liked. So this is Minerva Jones. I am Minerva, the village poetess, hooted at, jeered at by the yahoos of the street for my heavy body, cockeye, and rolling walk, and all the more when Butch Weldy captured me after a brutal hunt. He left me to my fate with Dr. Myers, and I sank into death, growing numb from the feet up, like one stepping deeper and deeper into a stream of ice. Will someone go to the village newspaper and gather into a book the verses I wrote? I thirsted so for love. I hungered so for life. Stuff like that, where a lot of these characters are presented as, for example, sort of the town gossip or, the town eccentric, and through these kind of explanations of their lives, these characters who are kind of seen as just sort of yahoos or just unimportant people, they're given a depth and a nuance that they weren't afforded in life. And I just thought that was really interesting and very surprisingly nuanced and sympathetic for a book from this era, There is some, like stuff about like the Civil War and stuff and how Lincoln ruined everything. But on the whole, I think Masters seemed to be, at least based on these poems, a very sort of pragmatic person in the sense of, small town life and sort of the encroaching of, the future and stuff like that. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this. And I'm always happy to step outside of my reading comfort zone. So thank you, Wes, for getting me to do that with this book. I would definitely like to read more poems like this if anybody knows of them. I know Edgar Lee Masters wrote a follow-up to this, I believe, but I heard it's not as well received, so I don't know, who knows. But yeah, this was really, really interesting. I liked it. Next, I have Open Throat by Henry Hoke. This was another book club read. This is our book club read for this month, actually. We're meeting up next weekend. And yeah, this was really interesting. This is actually recommended by Nakia, who'd read it before. And this is a very, very, very short, almost like a novella. Yeah, 160 pages. Actually, a lot like Spoon River Anthology, written in sort of a free verse almost. And this follows a queer mountain lion who lives on the outskirts of Hollywood, I think near, like, right below the Hollywood sign in, like, a little cave, and he's kind of exploring that whole area. And it's basically just following him throughout his day as he kind of wanders around and listens to, people's conversations and kind of ruminates on sort of life and humanity and sexuality and all that kind of stuff. I'm not even really sure how to describe this, but it's very, again, it's like the previous book. There's a lot of mordant humor, very black humor. There's a lot of sort of a commentary on sort of the rat race of humanity, his sort of incomprehensibility of humans, how he doesn't understand a lot of things that they do, a lot of the words that they use. So, for example, L.A., it's written as one word, L.A., E-L-L-A-Y, and he overhears a conversation in the beginning of the book with these two guys talking about scarcity, but he interprets it as scare city, and he thinks about, oh, that's true, we do live in scare city, so, sort of metaphorical stuff like that, which in another novel I think might feel a little bit too precious, but here I think it's very controlled, it's very funny, and it opens with him seeing he's basically watching somebody film like a guerrilla porno, where this guy is like getting his balls whipped by this bulky man in sort of an Indiana Jones getup, and he talks a lot about how looking at the pulsating vein in his neck and kind of feeling the hunger, kind of two very different types of hunger. In fact, I really loved how it opened. I've never eaten a person, but today I might. I don't know. It's just very like. I don't want to say fish out of water, but it's very sort of like, again, very liminal, this creature kind of outside of society, on the outside looking in, trying to understand humanity. And he just says a lot of stuff throughout the book that's just very relatable. The very first few pages, it says, I try to understand people, but they make it hard. And, there's just lots of stuff like that I found very relatable. And as you read through more of the story, you learn a little bit more about his backstory, how he used to live in the mountains, but he was forced to cross what they call, I believe, the Long Death, which is, the freeway that's cutting off the mountains from the rest of the city. And he was basically forced into exile by his father, who, it's implied in the book was a very sort of domineering force, very high pressure and things like that. Yeah, it's just very interesting. Again, I'm not really sure how to kind of interpret it. I mean, I get the sense that, obviously it's using the lion as a metaphor for, queerness, of existing outside of yourself, of sort of displacement. He ends up befriending kind of this group of this homeless encampment where he kind of goes and checks on them, make sure they're all right. There's even a bit where he like leaves them some money because somebody drops it, and he realizes like, oh, the humans like these green papers, and these people need it, so I'll just leave it for them. Stuff about alienation and things like that. Loneliness. And again, I mean, a lot of the stuff that it goes into in terms of LA and, sort of LA culture and stuff isn't necessarily the most, unique in the world. It's not necessarily that we haven't heard these before, but it's just presented in a very interesting way, especially with the prose style, where it's all written in free verse with, basically no punctuation. And a lot of, like, as you can see, a lot of the dialogue is written in italics. And it's just very jagged and kind of dreamlike almost. It was just really, really interesting. I liked it a lot. I need to actually reread it again, I think, before the meetup to kind of crystallize some of my feelings on it. Because as I say, it's 160 pages. It's written in free verse, so I read this in like a couple hours. And I actually found out through my research, it's actually inspired by a real lion who was named P22, I believe. Yeah, P22, who was a real lion who actually existed sort of in the LA area, and he was a bit of a local celebrity, but he was put down, unfortunately. And so this book is almost kind of like an exploration of him and kind of thinking about, using him as a jumping off point to explore, all of these things, and it's really interesting. And of course, there's a queer element too, which culminates in a scene where he finds two guys having sex in a cave, and that's pretty, that gets pretty intense. And there's a lot of stuff, because he's a starving lion, he's having trouble finding, meat and stuff. He talks a lot in the book about, wanting to eat a person and kind of trying to resist the temptation and conflating, like sex and death and that kind of stuff. And in that sense, it gave me a real sort of Exquisite Corpse kind of vibe, which I really enjoyed. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting book. As I say, I need to kind of read it again and situate all my thoughts. But as I say, I'm glad I read it. Thank you, Nakia, for the recommendation. Should be interesting to talk about it at book club. Next, I read, I mentioned this in my previous video, I read The Black Stallion by Walter Farley. I don't want to spend too long on this because I really honestly just don't have much to say about it, but this is a classic children's novel from the 40s about a boy and his black stallion. He's shipwrecked on an island, on a desert island with the black stallion, who's, very wild and crazy, and through their time on the island is able to tame him, and then they end up getting rescued, and they end up trying to race him. So I read this again on Nakia's recommendation because I don't remember what we were talking about, sort of like depictions of sort of like wild horse, sort of the relationship between like man and animal and stuff like that. And this was I don't know. I was really interested in this because I mentioned before in my previous video, I've kind of been thinking a lot about sort of like horse books, sort of the horse girl books and stuff. Everybody knows Black Stallion and Black Beauty, but I've never read either. So this is kind of a part of that as well. And to be honest, like, I just didn't like this very much. It's written very simplistically, and like, yeah, it's a kid's book, but I mean, it's just very, like, the prose and the dialogue and everything is just very straightforward. It's very vague. The kid in the book, his name is Alec, and he basically has, like, no problems whatsoever. Like, he gets back from the island and basically he's, like, totally fine, and his family and everybody are, like, really, like, blasé about letting him keep the horse and like ride it and stuff despite everything that's been going on. Nothing really basically goes wrong for him ever. He doesn't really like struggle for anything, or at least you don't really get a sense of it. And of course I know it's a kid's book. I'm not expecting, deep psychological studies or anything like that. But it really is just very like, for example, like, there's a scene where they're taking the horse off of a ship. It's the first time they're in New York. And all of the cameras and stuff are going off, and there's all this loud noise, and it's like totally crazy and chaotic. And the stallion starts like freaking out and like rearing and stuff to the point where like I think Alec is like actually like kicked in the face and he's like knocked down and everything. And a cop even like pulls out his gun and he's like, "No, don't shoot. It's fine. Like I'll control him." And he gets him under control. And the cop's like, "Okay, fine, but I won't do anything unless he hurts somebody else." And it's just very like everyone is just very calm and very like there's no real like struggle or anything. There was another example where the captain who helps Alec out, kind of returning home. He basically Alec is like, "Oh, my parents wired me money. Will you come with me to the bank to like help me do it and stuff?" And he does, and like everything's perfect and wonderful, and nothing goes wrong, and everybody's helpful. I want to say that it felt almost like the author just wanted to get to the horse stuff. But then he doesn't even really spend a lot of time on the horse stuff. So of course, he meets his old neighbor, turns out to be, an impressive jockey who like rode this old horse to victory back in the day, and he's kind of like, he wants to train him to kind of like relive his glory and stuff like that. But a lot of the actual horse training stuff is very vague. You just kind of get these descriptions of Alec riding the stallion around, and you don't really get a sense of like how they kind of train him or what it takes to be a jockey. And again, I'm not expecting like high detail or anything like that, but you would think that would be part of the interest in a book like this, is about that relationship between kind of man and beast, and how do you take something that's kind of like, untempered metal and kind of form it into something, disciplined, where you can race it and stuff like that. And there's not really anything like that. Like, there's even a scene where the trainer's like, "I've taught you everything I know," but it's like, what did you teach him other than like, here's how to put on a saddle and ride a horse? Spoiler alert, but they win the race. Everything just kind of comes so easily to him. There's no struggle. The dialogue is so bland. Everybody sounds exactly the same except for their Italian neighbor, who of course talks like a Mario, lots of this, Dio mio and stuff like that. And it's just so like, all right, I feel like this is one of those kids books where it's more important for kind of its influence rather than the actual book. In fact, a lot of people seem to really like the film version from 1979, so I've been meaning to watch that. I'm curious to see what that's like, and I feel like the movie will probably fill in a lot of those gaps that I wanted. Like, for example, I was really intrigued about, the whole like being stranded on a desert island and having to work together with this wild beast. And the actual like island stuff is like 45 pages in the whole, it's like that much of the book. And as I say, everything's very vague, you don't really get a sense of like who the characters are or the atmosphere or anything, you know, so it was just very, very disappointing. Just not my thing, not very interesting. I mean, I'm sure a lot of kids read this and loved it, but it just felt very simplistic, a whole lot of nothing, unfortunately. Sorry. So being June, of course, that means it's June on the Range this month. And again, I don't want to like commit myself to like a long, you know, sort of TBR list of stuff because, you know, my life, you know, things are always happening and I don't want to commit to like a huge thing. But if a reading event comes along and I have a book that I think will kind of fit the bill, I try to at least slip it in if I can. So because it's June on the Range, I read Journal of the Gun Years by Richard Matheson. This is one that's come highly recommended by a lot of people I know on BookTube who are into westerns and stuff. I know Michael K. Vaughan really enjoyed it, and a few other people. So this is one I was really excited to get to because I like Richard Matheson a lot, and again, I'm always trying to kind of, you know, step outside of my reading comfort zone. I was part of one of the earlier June on the Ranges back in 2022, I think, or 2021, I can't remember, because I love Western films, but I don't often venture into novels, and I never really understood why. I never really thought about why. So I was very eager to dig into this. This is about a famous gunslinger, Marshal Clay Halser, who is unceremoniously killed at the age of 31, I believe. And this is presented as his journal that's been collected by a journalist friend of his and is being kind of like edited and presented for publication as we kind of explore sort of the true story of this very famous gunfighter and kind of, you know, digging through sort of the legends to find the truth of the man and stuff like that. You know, very, very like, you know, typical Western stuff, you know, the man who shot Liberty Valance, that type of thing. And again, I mean, this was kind of disappointing. I'm sorry. It wasn't a bad book. So I really liked the conceit of it being presented as if it's this real journal that's being, you know, collected by this guy, you know, who knew the author and stuff. Yeah, Frank Leslie. There's a lot of funny asides from Frank Leslie where he kind of like fills in the gaps of a certain, you know, historical context, or, you know, explains things that like Clay Halser was talking about, or some of the characters that he meets. And there's even like little interjections that I thought were really funny, like there's a bit where Clay Halser has sex with this circus lady. Here I must omit 3 paragraphs which, in their vivid clinical description, are unsuitable for the general reader. So little things like that. And it also has a lot of interesting stylistic touches, like where it censors out, like, you know, bad words like bastard and stuff like that, where it's just B and then a line and things like that, which I thought were really interesting and again, kind of gave it a lot of verisimilitude, you know, in the sense of, you know, it made it feel like something from that era. And I thought the character's voice was very well presented too. Like Frank Leslie talks about in the beginning of the book, you know, how he had to basically like edit the manuscript for, you know, grammar and things like that. And as an example, he leaves the first entry unedited. As you can see there, it's full of like, you know, spelling errors and things like that. And then the rest of the book is you know, written normally. But he talks about how, you know, Clay Halser learned a lot more about reading and writing as he got older, and you get a sense of that through the book. You know, he starts using kind of bigger words and writing a little bit more eloquently and stuff like that. So that was all really interesting. My main thing about it was that, one, it's very, very episodic, which, you know, makes sense in terms of, you know, the story and stuff like that. A lot of characters just kind of jump in and out of the narrative. You never really get to know any of them, really. So that there's bits like in the book where he's going on about like all of the important people in his life, and I had to think about like, who was that again? Because they just left so little impression. And I think part of that is because the narrative itself jumps around a lot. So, for example, and this was something that kind of annoyed me. Rather than say, like showing, you know, for example, some of the passage of time, Frank Leslie will cut in and just basically give like a quick summary of like, you know, here's what happened over the previous like 6 months or a year or whatever, you know, and he became very close to this person, you know, and then we jump ahead to whatever the next like salient, you know, entry is. And that just made the pacing just feel very kind of jagged, and I couldn't really get a sense of like, I didn't really get a sense of the passage of time or like how he was growing as a person. It felt like a bit of a cheat, honestly. Like, rather than going into detail about, you know, explaining all these things, like, for example, it talks about how he's arrested at one point and he's kept in like this really abusive jail for like over a year until he's exonerated. And again, all of that is just explained in like a little paragraph presented by Frank Leslie, where it just talks about like, you know, oh, he was in this jail for a long time, he was abused, it was really horrible. And then it's like, oh, we're back on the outside, and we don't really get a sense of like what happened to him, how he was changed, you know. It's just very like, it's very jagged, it's very It's hard to really like get a handle on things. And I understand like maybe that's because, you know, they wanted to keep it short. A lot of these Western novels, in my experience, are pretty short. And obviously he's not going for like a big Larry McMurtry epic kind of thing. But I just thought it really was kind of doing the story a disservice, where rather than kind of having enough detail to draw you in and kind of get you invested and to really get a sense of who the characters are and how they're growing and changing throughout the narrative, it really just kind of like skips ahead all of the stuff that I wanted to know about, you know? Like there's this other girl that he like falls in love with, and it just says like, oh, they fell in love over the next few months or whatever, and it's like, well, can I see some of that, please? You know, because up to this point, like without any of that detail, it's like this is just a woman, you know, this is just a person, you know, and there's so, as I say, there's so many people coming in and out of the narrative constantly. Nobody really stands out as a character except for Clay himself, I suppose. But even then, we don't really get a sense of how Clay became what he is, you know. But then I did enjoy it once you get kind of towards the latter half of the novel, and it starts settling into his experiences as a marshal, and you get a sense of the narrative around him building, you know, kind of the legend around him building, and how that leads to all of this pressure from, you know, all these different, you know, sides, you know, people who want to challenge him, you know, people who look down on him because of, you know, they see him as like a remorseless killer, you know, stuff like the pressures of being a marshal, you know, and you know, how his wife like struggles with that and everything, how you can kind of feel the noose like closing around him, getting tighter and tighter, you know, that sort of specter of death, something that you see in a lot of Western novels. And I thought that was all really, really interesting. I thought that was kind of the best part for me, you know, that sense of growing paranoia and that sort of black cloud, you know. But aside from that, like a lot of the events in the novel, without, as I say, without a lot of that extra detail to really make them pop, a lot of it is just kind of like, man, how many Western stories have we seen like this before? You know, there's like the Civil War stuff, you know, there's he works as a rancher for a little bit, there's an encounter with Native Americans, you know, there's a whole bit where he gets involved between, you know, a standoff between like, you know, this small businessman and like this big bank who's like lording over him. You know, it just kind of feels like Matheson threw a bunch of like Western tropes into a blender and just kind of put them all in one story. And again, I get that, you know, tropes in and of themselves aren't bad, you know? I mean, what would a Western be without, you know, gunslinging, you know? Again, a lot of them just felt kind of plopped in there willy-nilly, and without that emphasis on, you know, detail and really getting to feel a sense of the characters and the world and stuff, it really just feels like tropes. It just feels like backdrops to, you know, his story. And he's the main character of the story, so to have it be so vague and kind of like unexpanded upon, it didn't leave me with much, and that was really frustrating. And again, like, I don't want to harp on this, but I can accept, you know, native characters who are kind of underdeveloped and don't really get to add much to the narrative, especially because this is being presented as someone's journals from that time period. I can accept that, you know, we're not going to get a nuanced portrayal of that. But there was this one bit, I think around halfway or a third through the book, where he ends up working for this like station master who's this like big scary gay German pervert who's like obsessed with like whipping him, and like, you know, he gets drunk and he's like always like trying it on with him and stuff, you know, he's like this perverted man, you know, and it talks about in the notes, in the journalist's notes, it talks about he was like kicked out of the army for all of his dalliances with like younger men in the army, and it was just a little disappointing. It's like, you know, I'm not immune to like sort of depictions like that, and especially in older books like these, and in, you know, a very sort of hyper masculine genre like the Western. But it was presented so in just such a stereotypical sort of unironic way that I was just kind of like rolling my eyes. It's like, all right, he's like comically evil, and of course his homosexuality is like part of his evilness, you know. And for a book from 1991, I mean, it just felt very like, all right, you know, like it just left a bad taste in my mouth. So I mean, again, I mean, I feel like I'm really shitting on it. I didn't hate it. I enjoyed the writing. I mean, and it was a very quick, easy read. You know, I enjoyed my time with it. But I guess just based on all of the hype, I kind of expected a little bit more, especially from a writer of Matheson's caliber. I just thought it was really disappointing, to be honest. But I would like to read, he's written a few other Westerns, I know. I don't remember what they're called, but some people say they liked them better than this. I would like to give those a try, you know. And I've also been thinking about, like, is it the fact that it's like maybe I'm just not used to sort of literary Westerns? Because, again, it's one thing where you can just depict these things on camera, but it's harder to kind of bring some of those same things across in writing, where to kind of make up for the lack of sort of visual splendor, you have to focus more on the psychology. And there was a little bit of that, but not enough for me to really be like enraptured with it. Not horrible, but not amazing, unfortunately. And finally, we have Goldfinger by Ian Fleming. So I've been slowly making my way through the Bond books. I think last August I reviewed Dr. No briefly. I talked about it. And with the recent release of the new James Bond video game, 007 First Light, which I really, really enjoyed, I got, sucked back into Bond again. So I've been like watching all kinds of, Bond YouTubers and rewatching some of my favorite films. And me and my friends, we started watching some of them last year. We watched all the Brosnans, and we started the Craigs. We watched Casino Royale. But I want to kind of continue with that with them and see how they enjoy it. Other Laura and Nakia Laura, I have two Lauras in my life now, but I especially wanted to go through those with her because, I kind of wanted her to see kind of what Austin Powers was parodying and, kind of what Bond is all about. But yeah, I love Bond. And part of that has been motivating me to pick the books back up again. And I actually read a good chunk of this when I was at the ranch, so that was really nice. Again, I enjoyed this, but I didn't think it was good, but not great. Broadly, for like the first half of the book, it's very surprisingly faithful to the movie. It's not exact, but you can see where, a lot of it comes from. And it's really, really exciting. Actually, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this, that you don't often see people talk about in regards to Bond as a character, so like people talk about, Daniel Craig's era, and they talk about, oh, they made Bond so dour and mopey and stuff like that. That's from Fleming, The thing that surprises me about a lot of the Flemings that I've read is Bond spends a lot of time, like, being kind of miserable and moping a lot. For example, in the beginning of this book, the story opens with him in Miami, kind of reflecting on a recent mission he had in Mexico where he had to kill a man, and he's like sitting there and feeling very dour about it, about having to take another man's life, and thinking about, yes, he was a bad person, and it's probably a good thing that I removed him, but it's like, is this all that my life is to be, just years and years of just death, It's all just very melancholy, and he's kind of resolved himself to, like, all right, I'm going to go drink and get fucked up and stuff. And he ends up meeting a guy who's an American businessman who was in Casino Royale, which was a nice callback, one of the other players, where he says, hey, there's this guy Goldfinger, and I think he's cheating me at cards. Can you help with that? And again, and then that kicks off, and we basically get into, like in the movie, where he uncovers Goldfinger's, deception and things like that. That was all well and good. And then it just gets pretty ridiculous in the last half. I mean, again, not that, I'm averse to Bond being ridiculous. That's part of the appeal to Bond, I think, But Goldfinger's Gold Knox plot in the book is just very... stretches credibility, and... Bond getting involved in it, in the movie, he gets out of it by saying, he brings up Operation Grand Slam, and, Goldfinger's, like, intrigued by that. In this, he basically is like, oh, well, I'll come work for you. And Goldfinger employs him and Tilly Masterton as his secretary, basically, of, like, taking notes of, like, all of the gangsters that he's getting together and all of the all of the, like, planning for Operation Grand Slam, which basically involves stealing all the gold from Fort Knox rather than irradiating it, like in the movie, which is interesting because the movie actually kind of pointed out the plot hole where Goldfinger says that he's going to steal all the gold, but then he reveals he's actually going to irradiate it and destabilize the economy, because they explain in the movie, it's like, that'll take you like 12 days to get all the gold out, that doesn't make any sense. And I think the movie overall improves on the book by making Bond a lot more involved in the action. So, for example, in the movie, we actually see the inside of Fort Knox, and there's this whole, action scene in that inside of it. Whereas in the book, we just kind of drive around the outside of it in a train and things like that. So yeah, I think actually this is one of the cases where the movie actually improved greatly on the book, in my opinion. And again, I understand these are old books, and you have to kind of just accept that there's not going to be not great, sexual, racial politics and things like that. But once again, Fleming is complaining about everything that he dislikes, which in this book includes Koreans, because Oddjob is Korean, and Goldfinger employs, Koreans and everything. And he goes on and on and on throughout the book about, like, all the shifty Koreans, with their yellow faces and stuff, and like, oh, how I hate them, they're the lowest of the low. And in regards to Pussy Galore, who, again, this was something else that I thought the movie improved on. Pussy Galore is really not in the book very much, and she doesn't leave that much of an impression, but in the film, she gets a much expanded role. In this, and the movie implied this, the book is explicit with it, she's a lesbian, and there's this whole, bit where Bond is just going on and on about, lesbians and kind of homosexuals in general. So for context, Tilly Masterton, is also a lesbian, and she's obsessed with Pussy Galore the second she meets her, We're gonna go into spoilers here, but I have to spoil it just to talk about, how annoying it is. So, so she's obsessed with Pussy Galore, and she ends up getting killed because, Bond is, trying to escape with her off the train, and instead of going with her, she's like, no, Pussy will protect me, Pussy will protect me, I must go to her, and Oddjob ends up throwing his bowler hat at her and killing her. And of course, it's presented as she was killed because of her refusal to adhere to, the heteronormative, ways. She wanted to go with the woman instead of the man and stuff like that. And Bond has this whole thing about, homosexuals that was just, I'll read it. Bond came to the conclusion that Tilly Masterton was one of those girls whose hormones had got mixed up. He knew the type well and thought they and their male counterparts were a direct consequence of giving votes to women and sex equality. As a result of 50 years of emancipation, feminine qualities were dying out or being transferred to the males. Pansies of both sexes were everywhere, not yet completely homosexual, but confused, not knowing what they were. The result was a herd of unhappy sexual misfits, barren and full of frustrations, the women wanting to dominate and the men to be nannied. He was sorry for them, but he had no time for them. Bond smiled sourly to himself as he remembered his fantasies about this girl as they sped along the valley of the Loire. Entre deux Seines, indeed. It's one of those things where it's again, I can accept problematic things in these older books. You have to if you're going to read them. But when it's just so overt like that, and it's so, for lack of a better word, cringy, it's just, you can't help but just be like, all right, And in the most ridiculous plot development, in the last page of the book, of course, he ends up hooking up with Pussy Galore, who, to this, has never expressed any interest in him up to this point. And he says that, he's like, I thought you only liked women, and she's like, I never met a real man. And she talks about how, she became lesbian because her uncle molested her as a child, and so ever since then she became a man-hater, but Bond was just so manly and masculine and just so, full of just virile manliness that, he was able to change her, and it's just like, all right, Fleming, shut up. And of course, again, I mean, the movies, have their fair share of problematic elements too, but I think them kind of softening that aspect of it was at least more palatable, you didn't have, Bond going on these, long monologues about his feelings about gay people and shit like that. There was just a lot of just kind of eye-rolly, kind of very ridiculous contrivances and just very cringy things in the last half that really kind of made the whole thing falter for me. But I do, there was stuff that I really liked about it, as I say, I think when he gets into the psychology of Bond, I find that really interesting. And it's also interesting to see the evolution of Bond as a character, how he kind of slowly, in this book especially, he is very quite, quippy and stuff like that, and he is kind of becoming more of that sort of Connery-esque, the filmic character that we know and love. So that was really interesting. I just wish that, things had been thought through a little better. But I definitely do want to continue on with the series. I believe the next book is For Your Eyes Only, which is a short story collection, and then Thunderball. So I'm very interested to see how those go, especially because it gives me an excuse to rewatch the films and kind of see the differences between them, which is one of the things I've been enjoying about these reads. So kind of a sort of very mixed bag these last few weeks, but that is how it goes sometimes. But I've got a lot of other things to talk about that I'm going to finish sometime soon, hopefully. There's also Private Eye July coming up next month, and I've got some things lined up for that I'm excited to talk about. So until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.